Nathaniel Pierce adjusted his billion-dollar suit, the fabric a silent testament to a life of unquestioned victory. In this sterile courtroom, his divorce was meant to be the final triumphant acquisition of his new life. He expected tears, a broken woman, the ghost of the wife he'd left behind. But then Isabel walked in, not broken, but forged. The simple, elegant dress she wore didn't whisper of defeat. It hummed with a quiet power he hadn't seen in years. Her eyes, clear and steady, met his. In that single, unnerving glance, Nathaniel realized this wasn't an ending. It was a reckoning. The air in courtroom 4B of the Stanley Mosque Courthouse was thick with the scent of old paper and refrigerated air, a sterile perfume for the quiet deaths of marriages. Nathaniel Pierce felt impervious to it. To him, this was just another boardroom, another negotiation where his position was unassailable. He sat at the polished mahogany table, a king in his bespoke Zegna suit, flanked by Preston Maddox, a lawyer whose ruthlessness was as legendary as his hourly rate. Beside him, Sienna, his fiancée, squeezed his hand. Her touch was manicured and cool, her diamond engagement ring catching the fluorescent light in a series of sharp, proprietary flashes. She was the future, young, vibrant, a beautiful testament to his success. He had mentally rehearsed this day for months. It was the final procedural step in closing a chapter he'd already rewritten. He imagined Isabel arriving flustered, her hair slightly askew, her eyes puffy from a night of crying. He pictured the woman he had left, a woman who had become, in his mind, a comfortable but faded photograph from a life he'd outgrown. He had prepared a look of detached sympathy, a gesture he'd practiced in the mirror of his new penthouse overlooking the glittering sprawl of Los Angeles. But the woman who pushed through the heavy courtroom doors was not a photograph. She was a stranger. Isabel moved with a serene, almost unnerving composure. The navy blue sheath dress she wore was modest, but perfectly tailored, her dark hair pulled back in a simple, elegant chignon. There were no signs of sleepless nights. The faint lines around her eyes spoke of wisdom, not sorrow. She wasn't leaning on her lawyer for support. She walked beside him as an equal. Her gaze swept the room once, cool, analytical, before landing on Nathaniel. It was not a look of hatred or heartbreak. It was a look of assessment, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time in a long while, and perhaps wasn't entirely impressed. The detached sympathy he'd prepared died on his lips. In its place, a cold knot of apprehension formed in his stomach. This was not the trembling, defeated woman his narrative required. "All rise!" the bailiff's voice boomed, and the wooden scrape of chairs filled the silence. Judge Miller, a woman with a reputation for suffering no fools, took her seat. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the parties before her. "We are here today to finalize the dissolution of the marriage between Nathaniel Pierce and Isabel Pierce. Mr. Maddox, I've reviewed the proposed settlement. It appears generous." Preston Maddox rose, his smile as smooth and polished as his shoes. "Indeed, Your Honor. Mr. Pierce wishes to ensure Ms. Pierce is well taken care of in recognition of their 22 years of marriage." He said it with an air of profound magnanimity, as if Nathaniel were gifting her a small country. Nathaniel watched Isabel for a reaction. A flicker of gratitude, relief. He saw nothing. She sat with a perfect, still posture, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Her lawyer, a man named Elias Thorne, whose firm was respectable but hardly in the same league as Maddox's, stood. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice calm and steady, "my client, Ms. Pierce, appreciates the thoroughness of Mr. Pierce's offer." A slight pause. Nathaniel felt Sienna shift beside him, her nails digging almost imperceptibly into his hand. "However," Thorne continued, "we are not here today to discuss the division of marital assets in the traditional sense. My client is not contesting the offer for the family home, the alimony, or the child support arrangements for their daughter, Sophia." Maddox's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. This wasn't in the script. Nathaniel leaned forward, the knot in his stomach tightening. What was this? Some play for more. Then what precisely are we here to discuss, Mr. Thorne? Judge Miller asked, her brow furrowing. Elias Thorne opened a leather-bound folder on the table. We are here, Your Honor, to file a motion to recognize Isabel Pierce not as a dependent spouse, but as a founding partner in Pierce Innovations. A stunned silence descended upon the courtroom. Nathaniel felt the blood drain from his face. He stared at Isabel, who finally turned her head and met his gaze directly. The quiet power he'd seen earlier now had a name: conviction. Sienna gasped beside him, a tiny, indignant sound. That is preposterous, Your Honor, Maddox sputtered, finding his voice. Pierce Innovations was founded by Mr. Pierce, and him alone. Ms. Pierce was a homemaker, a wonderful mother, I'm sure, but she had no involvement in the business. Is that so, Mr. Pierce? Judge Miller's gaze was now fixed on him, sharp as a shard of glass. Nathaniel opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His mind was reeling, thrown back 2 decades to a cramped garage smelling of oil and ambition. He saw Isabel, then just 24, poring over his chaotic schematics, her fine arts degree giving her an eye for design that he lacked. He remembered her selling her late father's car to pay for their first patent filing. He remembered her working 2 jobs to keep them afloat while he chased a dream, her belief in him the only real capital he'd had. He had forgotten, or rather, he had chosen to forget. He had buried those memories under layers of success, rewriting history until he was the sole protagonist, the self-made genius. Isabel's lawyer slid a document across the table. We have her father's cashed check for the patent. We have her design sketches for the first 3 product prototypes, and we have a dozen sworn affidavits from early employees who will testify that Isabel Pierce wasn't just a supportive wife. She was the architect of the company's entire user interface philosophy. Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling the facade of his life. He looked at Sienna, her face a mask of confusion and fury, her diamond ring suddenly looking gaudy and cheap. He looked at Isabel, her expression not triumphant but resolute. She wasn't there to ruin him. She was there for the truth. And in the crushing silence of that courtroom, Nathaniel Pierce, the man who had everything, realized he had already lost the only thing that ever truly mattered. The drive back to the Bel Air mansion was a silent, suffocating affair. Sienna, for once, was speechless, her mind visibly racing to calculate the financial implications of Isabel's bombshell. The shock had curdled into a venomous anger that radiated off her in waves. Nathaniel stared out the tinted window of the Bentley, the palm tree-lined streets of Los Angeles blurring into an indifferent green smear. The house, when they arrived, felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. It was a monument to his success, a sprawling structure of glass, steel, and white marble that Sienna had meticulously designed with the help of an architect who spoke more about negative space than comfort. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine, every piece of furniture a minimalist work of art that was terrifying to actually sit on. There were no fingerprints on the glass, no clutter on the counters, no life. I cannot believe her nerve, Sienna finally spat, slamming her ridiculously expensive purse onto a marble console table. The sound echoed in the cavernous foyer. A founding partner. After all you've given her, she's a greedy, bitter woman, Nathaniel. Preston will crush this. This is an insult. Nathaniel walked past her, his footsteps unnervingly loud on the marble floor. He went to the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked an infinity pool, which in turn overlooked the city. It was the view he'd always wanted, the proof that he was on top of the world. Today, it just looked lonely. She sold her father's car, he said, his voice quiet, distant. What? Sienna snapped, following him. What are you talking about? A 1968 Mustang. It was the only thing he left her, he continued, speaking more to the glass than to her. She loved that car, but our patent application was due and we were $2,000 short, so she sold it, didn't even hesitate. Sienna stared at him, her perfectly sculpted face a mixture of impatience and disbelief. "Nathaniel, that was 20 years ago. This is now. Are you seriously feeling sentimental? She is trying to steal millions of dollars from us." The word "us" hung in the air, feeling hollow and transactional. He turned to look at her. He saw the beautiful, ambitious woman he had chosen, the woman who adorned his arm at galas, who understood the currency of power and image. But for the first time, he found himself searching her face for something that wasn't there: shared history. She was a beautiful addition to his life, but Isabel had been the foundation. He was suddenly, violently, thrown back into a memory so vivid it felt like time travel. They were in the kitchen of their first home, a tiny rented bungalow in Pasadena that always smelled faintly of jasmine from the overgrown bush outside. He was 32, and Pierce Innovations had just landed its first major contract. He was terrified, ecstatic, and utterly exhausted. Leo, their son, was a toddler, banging a wooden spoon on a pot on the floor, and Sophia was a new, warm weight in Isabel's arms. Isabel was stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce, her hair in a messy bun, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She was wearing an old, paint-stained sweatshirt of his. She looked up and caught his eye, a slow, radiant smile spreading across her face. She didn't need to say a word. In that smile, he saw it all. "I believe in you. We can do this. We are in this together." Later that night, with the kids asleep, they sat on their lumpy second-hand couch, sharing a cheap bottle of wine. He confessed his fears, that he was an imposter, that he would fail and drag them all down with him. Isabel took his hand, her touch warm and solid. "Nathaniel," she'd said, her voice full of a fierce, quiet certainty, "failure is just a data point. We'll learn from it. But you won't fail, because your vision is brilliant, and you're not doing it alone." The memory faded, leaving a profound ache in its place. He looked around the sterile, silent mansion. He and Sienna didn't have conversations like that. They discussed stock portfolios, vacation destinations, and which charity event offered the best networking opportunities. They never talked about fear or failure, because in their world, such things were not supposed to exist. "Nathaniel, are you even listening to me?" Sienna's voice sliced through his reverie, sharp with irritation. "Preston is calling. We need a strategy." He looked at the infinity pool, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the cold, empty sky. He had built this life, this perfect, polished cage, piece by piece. He had traded the chaotic warmth of that Pasadena bungalow for this silent palace. He had traded a partner for an accessory. He thought he had upgraded, that he had shed his old life like a snake sheds its skin. But standing there, with the echo of his past ringing in his ears, he felt a terrifying, sickening realization dawn on him. He hadn't shed his old skin. He had shed his soul, and he hadn't even noticed it was gone until this very moment. He had won everything he ever wanted, and now he was bankrupt in ways his accountant could never measure. While Nathaniel was rattling around his gilded cage, Isabel was watering her hydrangeas. Her new home was a modest, two-story craftsman in a quiet South Pasadena neighborhood, the kind of place with a wide front porch and a slightly creaky screen door. It was a world away from the Bel Air mansion, and she had never felt more at peace. The house wasn't filled with art curated for its investment value. It was filled with the messy, vibrant art of her children, framed and hung with pride. The air smelled of potting soil, lemon furniture polish, and the chocolate chip cookies Sophia was baking in the kitchen. After leaving Nathaniel, or rather, after he had announced he was leaving her, there had been a period of freefall. The shock, the betrayal, the sheer public humiliation of it had been a physical blow. For weeks, she had functioned on autopilot. Her world shrunk to the immediate needs of her children, Leo and Sophia. Her friends had rallied, expecting her to crumble. They brought casseroles and wine and spoke of Nathaniel in hushed, furious tones. They told her to hire the most vicious lawyer she could find, to take him for every penny. But as the initial shock subsided, something else took its place. It wasn't a desire for revenge, it was a slow, dawning sense of clarity. For years, she had been living in Nathaniel's shadow, her own identity subsumed by her roles as wife of, mother of. The mansion had begun to feel like a prison long before Sienna's arrival, a place where her own passions, her art, her love for design, were treated as quaint little hobbies. She had looked at her children, at Leo's simmering anger and Sophia's quiet, confused pain, and realized that wallowing in victimhood was a luxury she couldn't afford. More than that, it wasn't who she was. The same woman who had sold her father's car and sketched logos on diner napkins was still in there, buried under years of domesticity. She just had to find her again. So she moved out of the mansion, refusing Nathaniel's offer to put her up in a sterile luxury condo. Instead, she found this house, a place that needed work, a place she could pour her own energy into. She started a small landscape design business, channeling her artistic eye into creating beautiful, serene gardens for people. It started with a friend's backyard, then a neighbor, and soon, through word of mouth, she had a waiting list. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar enterprise, but it was hers. She was building something again with her own two hands. "Mom, the cookies are ready," Sophia called from the kitchen. Isabel smiled, setting down the watering can. "They smell amazing, sweetie." She walked inside, the warmth of the kitchen wrapping around her. Sophia, at 16, had her father's sharp intellect, but her mother's compassionate heart. The divorce had hit her hard, but seeing her mother rediscover her own strength had been a powerful anchor. "Leo called," Sophia said, sliding a perfectly browned cookie onto a cooling rack. "He asked how it went today." Leo. Her son was 19, a sophomore at UCLA, and fiercely protective. He had seen the truth of his father's affair long before Isabel had allowed herself to, and his anger at Nathaniel was a raw, open wound. "It was interesting," Isabel said, choosing her words carefully. "Did Dad look surprised?" Sophia asked, her voice laced with a hint of satisfaction. Isabel thought of Nathaniel's face, the initial arrogance melting into stunned disbelief. "Yes," she said simply. "I think he was." She hadn't made the decision to file for her founding partnership lightly. It wasn't about the money, though she knew the value of what she was owed. It was about reclaiming her own history. For 2 decades, Nathaniel had told the story of Pierce Innovations, and with each retelling her role had diminished until it vanished completely. He wasn't just erasing her from his future, he was erasing her from their shared past. Her children, she realized, were growing up hearing a myth, a story where their father was a solitary genius and their mother was a footnote. She couldn't let that stand, not for her and not for them. "Your grandfather would be proud, you know," Isabel said softly, looking at Sophia. "He always said the most important thing you can own is your own story." Later that evening, after Sophia was upstairs doing homework, Isabel sat on her front porch swing, a cup of chamomile tea in her hands. The street was quiet, the air fragrant with night-blooming jasmine, the same scent as their first little house. She hadn't thought of that in years. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Elias Thorne. "Maddox called. He's threatening a countersuit for malicious intent. They're rattled, Isabel. Stay strong." A year ago, a message like that would have sent her into a panic. Tonight, she just felt a calm resolve. She wasn't the frightened, dependent woman they thought she was. She was the woman who had helped build an empire out of a garage. She had faced down bankruptcy, exhaustion, and overwhelming odds. A belligerent lawyer in a $1,000 suit hardly seemed intimidating by comparison. She thought about Nathaniel, not with anger, but with a profound and weary sadness. He had gained the world, but had lost his compass. He was adrift in a sea of his own making, surrounded by shiny, empty things. She wasn't fighting him for revenge. In a strange way, she was fighting for him, too. She was fighting for the truth. Because only by confronting the real story of how he got to the top would he ever have a chance of finding the man he used to be, the man who had been her partner in every sense of the word. The motion Isabel filed sent a shockwave through Nathaniel's carefully constructed world. The story was leaked to the financial press. Not the messy details of the affair, but the far more compelling narrative of the brilliant ex-wife claiming her stake in a tech empire. The headlines were brutal. The ghost in the machine. Did Nathaniel Pierce erase his co-founder? Suddenly, Nathaniel wasn't just a divorcing CEO, he was a potential fraud. The board of Pierce Innovations, a group of stoic, silver-haired men who valued stability above all else, were calling for emergency meetings. His stock price took a small but noticeable dip. The pressure inside the Bel Air mansion became unbearable. Sienna's initial fury had morphed into a frantic, obsessive campaign to manage the optics of the situation. She was on the phone constantly with PR agents and lawyers, her voice a sharp, commanding staccato that echoed through the marble halls. "We need to release a statement," she announced one evening, pacing in front of the cold, unlit fireplace. She was dressed in white silk pajamas that probably cost more than Isabel's monthly mortgage. Something that paints her as a disgruntled spouse lashing out. "We'll talk about your philanthropic work, your commitment to the company. We need to control the narrative, Nathaniel." Nathaniel was sitting in a leather armchair, a glass of untouched Macallan 25 in his hand. He was staring at an old photograph he'd dug out of a storage box, a faded Polaroid of him and Isabel, young and beaming, standing in front of their garage workshop. A sign they'd painted by hand was tacked to the door. "Pierce Innovations Headquarters." "There is no narrative, Sienna," he said, his voice tired. "There's just the truth." "The truth is what people believe," she retorted, her frustration boiling over. "And right now, they're starting to believe her. This is affecting the company. This is affecting my future. Our future." There it was again. The naked, unvarnished self-interest. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the raw panic in her eyes. She wasn't panicking for him, or for the integrity of his life's work. She was panicking because the gilded cage she had worked so hard to enter was under threat. The lifestyle, the status, the security, it was all tied to a number in a bank account, a number Isabel was now threatening to significantly reduce. "When we first met," Nathaniel said slowly, the memory surfacing with painful clarity, "you told me you were impressed by my drive, my vision." I still am," she said, her tone softening as she tried a different tactic. She came over and knelt by his chair, placing a hand on his knee. "You're the most brilliant man I've ever met." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You were impressed by my jet. You were impressed by my penthouse in New York. You were impressed by the fact I could shut down a Michelin star restaurant for a private dinner. You fell in love with the results, Sienna. You never had any interest in the process." She recoiled as if he'd slapped her. "That's not fair. I love you." The words sounded hollow, rehearsed. Did she? Or did she love the idea of him, the power he wielded? He remembered the grueling early years with Isabel, the 100-hour work weeks, the ramen noodle dinners, the constant gnawing fear of failure. Isabel had been in the trenches with him. She had celebrated every tiny victory and cushioned every crushing blow. Sienna had arrived for the victory parade, champagne flute in hand. The breaking point came a few days later. Nathaniel was on a conference call with the board, a brutal affair where he was forced to defend his personal integrity. He was exhausted and demoralized. After he hung up, he walked into their master bedroom to find Sienna surrounded by swatches of fabric and design magazines. "I'm thinking we should redo the Aspen house," she announced brightly, as if he hadn't just been professionally vivisected. "This decor is so dated. I want something more modern. Clean lines. What do you think of this Italian marble?" She held up a magazine, pointing to a bathroom that looked like a surgical suite. Nathaniel stared at her. The complete and utter disconnect from his reality was staggering. He was fighting for the soul of his company, for his reputation, and she was concerned with interior decorating. A dark, bitter laugh escaped his lips. "What's so funny?" she asked, her brow wrinkling. "The Aspen House," he said, the words dripping with an irony she couldn't possibly comprehend. "Isabel hated that house. She said it was ostentatious. She said we bought it to impress people we didn't even like." "Well, she was wrong," Sienna said defensively. "It's a statement property." "No, Sienna," he said, the exhaustion in his voice replaced by a sudden, chilling clarity. She was right. He walked over to the closet, a vast walk-in space larger than his first apartment. He pulled out a suitcase. "What are you doing?" Sienna asked, her voice rising in alarm. "I'm going to a hotel," he said, throwing shirts and trousers into the bag with methodical precision. "I need some space. I need to think." "Think about what? How to fight her?" "No," Nathaniel said, pausing to look at her, the Polaroid from the garage flashing in his mind. "I need to think about how to tell the truth." Panic flooded Sienna's face. This was a variable she hadn't accounted for. A Nathaniel who wasn't interested in fighting, in winning at all costs. "You can't be serious. You'll ruin everything." "For what? Some misplaced guilt over a woman you left behind?" "I didn't just leave her behind, Sienna," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I tried to erase her, and I'm just now beginning to understand the difference." He zipped the suitcase and walked out of the room, leaving her standing alone amidst her swatches and magazines, the silent queen of an empty, crumbling kingdom. The sterile quiet of the hotel suite was a welcome respite. For the first time in years, Nathaniel was surrounded by an absence of expectation. There were no board members to appease, no social calendars to manage, no Sienna trying to redecorate their life. There was only him and the crushing weight of his own choices. It was in this solitude that he realized the battle with Isabel over the company was a symptom of a much deeper disease. The real casualties of his war on the past were his children. He hadn't seen much of Leo and Sophia since the separation. He told himself it was because they were busy with their own lives. College, high school, friends. But the truth was, he had kept his distance because their presence was a mirror, reflecting a version of himself he didn't want to see. A failure as a father. His attempts at connection were clumsy and transactional. He'd send money, buy them expensive gifts they didn't ask for, and suggest outings to five-star restaurants where the silence between them was as thick and heavy as the velvet curtains. He decided to try again, not with a grand gesture, but with something simple. He called Sophia. "Hey, sweetie, it's Dad." The pause on the other end of the line was telling. "Hi. I was wondering, would you and Leo be free to get some pizza this weekend? That old place we used to go to in Larchmont, Sal's." Another pause. Sal's was their spot. It was cheap, loud, and had greasy red checkered tablecloths. It was where they went for birthdays and after soccer games. It was a place from the before. "I'll have to ask Leo," Sophia said, her voice non-committal. I'll text you." She did text, a few hours later. "Leo says we can do Saturday at 7. The lack of enthusiasm was palpable, but it was a yes. When he walked into Sal's that Saturday, they were already there, sitting in a booth in the back. Seeing them together was a jolt. Leo, with his dark, intense eyes, so like Isabel's, had a protective arm resting on the back of the booth behind his sister. Sophia was picking at a loose thread on her jeans, her shoulders hunched. They looked like two soldiers in hostile territory. "Hey," Nathaniel said, sliding into the booth. The vinyl was cracked and familiar. "Thanks for coming." "Sophia wanted to," Leo said, his voice flat. It was an immediate clarification. "I'm only here for her." The chasm between them felt immense, unbridgeable. He tried to fill it with small talk. He asked Leo about his classes, Sophia about her upcoming art project. Their answers were clipped, monosyllabic. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. The cheerful noise of the pizzeria, families laughing, orders being shouted, only highlighted their own strained silence. Their pizza arrived, a large pepperoni just like they always ordered. Nathaniel served them each a slice, a simple domestic act that felt alien and performative. It was Sophia who finally broke the tension. "Mom said you moved out of the house." "Yeah," Nathaniel said, grateful for the opening. "I'm at a hotel for a bit. Just needed some quiet." "Quiet from what?" Leo challenged, his eyes narrowing. "Your fiancé getting on your nerves? Is it hard work managing the life you blew ours up for?" "Leo," Sophia whispered, placing a hand on his arm. "No, it's a fair question," Nathaniel said, looking at his son. He saw not just anger, but deep, profound hurt. "I made a mess of things. I know that." "A mess?" Leo's laugh was harsh. "A mess is when you spill something. You detonated a bomb in the middle of our family and walked away with your new girlfriend while Mom had to pick through the rubble. You call that a mess?" Every word was true. Hearing it from his son was like swallowing glass. "What you're doing to Mom now, with the company," Leo continued, his voice shaking with restrained fury. "She told us the truth about everything, how she helped you start it. You didn't just leave her, you tried to steal her whole life story. Do you have any idea what that's like? To watch your mother have to fight for the credit for her own life against the man who was supposed to be her partner?" Nathaniel had no defense. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't sound like a hollow excuse, so he just sat there and took it. "Your mother," he said, his voice hoarse, "is the most brilliant, resilient person I've ever known, and I took that for granted. I forgot who I was, who we were. I started believing my own PR. I am so sorry for all of it." It wasn't enough. An apology couldn't stitch together the wounds he'd inflicted, but it was the first honest thing he'd said to his children in years. Sophia had been quiet, her eyes welling with tears. "I miss you," she whispered, so softly he barely heard it. "I miss who you used to be." That was the blow that finally shattered him. It wasn't Leo's anger, but Sophia's quiet grief. It was the realization that his children weren't just angry at his actions, they were mourning the father he had been. A father who went to their soccer games, who helped them with their homework, who existed in their lives as a warm, constant presence, not a wealthy, distant benefactor. He looked at his two children, these incredible people he and Isabel had raised, and saw the full, devastating extent of his choices. The money, the mansion, the praise of the business world. It was all ash. He had been so focused on building a legacy of success that he had completely destroyed his own family. His portrait in their lives was fading, and he was the one holding the eraser. The day they were due back in court, the atmosphere was entirely different. The story had taken on a life of its own, and the room was filled with a low buzz of anticipation. Nathaniel arrived alone. He had officially broken his engagement with Sienna, an ugly, transactional conversation that involved lawyers and non-disclosure agreements. It felt less like a breakup and more like a hostile merger falling apart. He felt no sadness, only a grim sense of relief, as if a fever had broken. He sat at his table, with Preston Maddox beside him. Maddox was tense, his usual slick confidence replaced by a brittle defensiveness. He had advised Nathaniel to fight Isabel's claim to the bitter end, to bury her in paperwork and drain her resources. Nathaniel had refused. "We are not going to countersue," Nathaniel had told him that morning. "We are not going to try and discredit her. We are going to listen." Maddox had looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. When Isabel walked in with Elias Thorne, she looked exactly the same, composed, resolute. But this time, when her eyes met Nathaniel's, he didn't look away. He held her gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of concession, of respect. He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes before she turned her attention to the judge. "Mr. Maddox," Judge Miller began, her tone all business. "Last time we were here, Mr. Thorne made a rather extraordinary claim on behalf of his client. Do you have a response?" Maddox stood, shuffling his papers. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the claim is baseless. While Mr. Pierce acknowledges his ex-wife's support in the early years, as any spouse would support another. This in no way constitutes a legal partnership. He droned on, citing legal precedents and corporate bylaws. Nathaniel barely listened. He was watching Isabel. He was remembering. He saw her at their kitchen table at 2 a.m., rewriting his business plan because, as she gently put it, his was brilliant on the tech, but a little fuzzy on the humans. He saw her charm their first skeptical investor, not with numbers, but with a passionate, eloquent explanation of how their product would genuinely improve people's lives. He was the engineer. She was the conscience. He had built the engine, but she had drawn the map. "Mr. Thorne?" the judge prompted when Maddox finally wound down. Elias Thorne stood. "Your Honor, we could spend weeks deposing early employees. We could bring in forensic accountants and intellectual property experts. We could turn this into a long, ugly, and very public war." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Nathaniel saw Maddox tense, preparing for the attack. "But my client has no desire to do that," Thorne continued. "This was never about waging a war. It was about correcting the record. Therefore, we'd like to propose a different kind of settlement." He placed a single slim folder on the table. A bailiff delivered it to Judge Miller and another to Maddox. Nathaniel leaned over to look at Maddox's copy. It wasn't a demand for money. It wasn't a claim for a percentage of the company. It was a single double-spaced page. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "The Official History of Pierce Innovations, the Founding Years." Below it was a narrative, a story. It detailed the company's inception, not as the myth of the lone male genius, but as the truth, a partnership. It spoke of the garage, of Isabel's inheritance, of her design contributions, of her role in shaping the company's ethos. It didn't diminish Nathaniel's role as the technological visionary, but it elevated hers to its rightful place as co-founder, strategist, and moral compass. The final paragraph was the settlement proposal. It stated that Isabel would waive all claims to founding shares and any financial stake beyond the standard marital asset division. In return, the document, this true history, was to be entered into the official corporate record of Pierce Innovations. It was to be framed and hung in the lobby of the corporate headquarters, and it was to be the first page of the About Us section on the company's website, in perpetuity. She wasn't asking for his money, she was asking for the truth. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Preston Maddox stared at the page, utterly flummoxed. This was a move so far outside the legal playbook he had no response. You couldn't fight a story with a lawsuit. Judge Miller finished reading, took off her glasses, and looked from the page to Isabel and then to Nathaniel. A slow, knowing look of profound respect dawned on her face. "Mr. Pierce?" she asked, her voice softer than before. "What is your response to this proposal?" This was the moment, the culmination of everything. He could still fight. He could revert to the man he had been, the man who won at all costs. He could save his fortune and his ego, or he could save himself. Nathaniel stood up slowly. He didn't look at his lawyer. He looked directly at Isabel. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and steady, finding a strength he didn't know he still possessed. "I have read Ms. Pierce's document, and I find it to be completely accurate." A collective gasp went through the room. Her contributions were not just supportive, they were foundational. Without her, there would be no Pierce Innovations. "I accept her proposal in its entirety, and I would like to state for this court and for the record that I am profoundly sorry for my attempts to write her out of a history that is as much hers as it is mine." He looked at Isabel. For the first time, her serene composure broke. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or victory. It was a tear of release. The truth, after so many years, had finally been spoken. The immediate aftermath was a blur. The bang of the judge's gavel was a starting pistol for a flurry of motion. Lawyers huddled, reporters scrambled, but Nathaniel saw none of it. He felt a strange lightness, as if a massive, invisible weight he'd been carrying for years had just been lifted. He had publicly surrendered, given up the myth he'd so carefully constructed, and in doing so, he had won back a piece of himself he thought was gone forever. Preston Maddox was apoplectic. "Nathaniel, what have you done?" he hissed as they were packing their briefcases. "You just handed her a public relations nuke. You've admitted, on the record, that the official story of your company was a lie." "No, Preston," Nathaniel said calmly, meeting his lawyer's furious gaze. "I just admitted the truth. There's a difference." He signed the last of the paperwork his lawyer thrust at him, his hand steady. He felt no regret. He saw Isabel and Elias Thorne across the room, quietly speaking with the court clerk. He knew he had to talk to her, not to negotiate or explain, but simply to finish. He walked over, his footsteps echoing his thumping heart. Thorne saw him coming and, with a nod to Isabel, discreetly stepped away. They stood facing each other in the now emptying courtroom. The silence between them was no longer fraught with tension, but filled with the weight of 24 years of shared history, the good, the bad, the beautiful, and the broken. "Thank you, Nathaniel," Isabel said, her voice quiet. It wasn't the triumphant thanks of a victor, but a simple, genuine acknowledgement. "Don't thank me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You shouldn't have had to do any of this. It was your story all along. I'm just sorry it took me this long to remember how to read it." He searched her face, looking for the anger and resentment that he deserved to see there. But it was gone. In its place was a deep, weary sadness and something else. A flicker of the old compassion, the empathy that he had mistaken for weakness for so long. "Why?" he asked, the question escaping him before he could stop it. "Why do it this way, Isabel? You could have taken me for millions. You could have crippled the company." She looked away for a moment, toward the large windows that overlooked the city. What would that have accomplished? Our children would see their father ruined and their mother become a bitter, wealthy woman. The company we built together would be tarnished. It would have all been for nothing. "I didn't want to destroy our past, Nathaniel. I wanted to reclaim it." She turned back to him, her eyes clear and direct. "This was never about money. It was about our children. I wanted Leo and Sophia to know that the woman who raised them was not just somebody's wife. I wanted them to know that their mother helped build something important. I wanted them to know that a partnership, a real one, is about more than what's written on a stock certificate." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. In all his calculations, all his selfish justifications, he had never once considered that perspective. He had been so consumed with what he was gaining, while she had been fighting for what their children were losing. A history to be proud of. A raw, ragged sob broke from his chest. It was a sound of pure, undiluted grief for his marriage, for his family, for the man he had failed to be. The polished facade of Nathaniel Pierce, CEO, shattered completely, leaving only a broken, contrite man. He didn't try to hide it. He let her see the full depth of his reckoning. Isabel didn't rush to comfort him. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply stood there and bore witness to his pain, granting him the dignity of his own breakdown. She had seen him at his best and his worst, and she was seeing him now at his most stripped down and honest. After a long moment, he finally managed to get himself under control. He wiped his eyes, feeling utterly exposed. "I'm selling the house," he said, the words tumbling out. "And Sienna. We're done. It's over." He wasn't saying it to win her back. He knew that was impossible. He was saying it because he needed her to know that the illusion was over. He was done with the life he'd built on a foundation of lies. Isabel simply nodded, accepting the information without judgment. "What will you do now?" "I don't know," he admitted, and it was the most honest answer he'd given in a decade. "Try to be a father. Try to be a better man." It sounded hopelessly cliché, but in the quiet of that courtroom, it felt like a sacred vow. He knew he couldn't earn her forgiveness, not really. That wasn't his to ask for, but maybe, just maybe, he could start the long, arduous process of earning back his own self-respect. 3 months later, the world looked different. True to his word, Nathaniel had implemented Isabel's proposal. The newly christened founding story was the first thing visitors saw on the Pierce Innovations website. A beautifully framed copy, printed on archival paper, hung in the lobby right next to the company's mission statement. It caused a stir in the industry, but a positive one. The story of reconciliation and integrity was far more powerful than the story of a messy divorce. The company's stock, after the initial wobble, had never been higher. Nathaniel sold the Bel Air mansion and moved into a modest, comfortable apartment in Santa Monica, a few miles from the beach. He sold the jet and the Bentley. He started taking the lead on the company's philanthropic foundation, a part of the business he'd always delegated, and found a surprising sense of purpose in it. He was working to build something that wasn't measured in profit margins. The most difficult work, however, was rebuilding the ruins of his family. It was a slow, painstaking process with no guarantee of success. He didn't try to buy his children's affection anymore. Instead, he showed up. He went to Sophia's art shows and Leo's university debates. He didn't sit in the front row. He stood quietly in the back, expecting nothing. He sent them texts, not to arrange meetings, but to say he was proud of them. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. Leo had a major economics presentation, and his laptop crashed the night before. After trying everything, in a moment of desperation, he called Nathaniel. Nathaniel dropped everything and spent the next 6 hours with his son, not as a CEO delegating a problem, but as a father, patiently helping him recover the files and rebuild the presentation. They worked until dawn, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of purpose. As the sun came up, Leo looked at him across the kitchen table, exhaustion and gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks, Dad," he said. The two words were a bridge across a vast canyon. His relationship with Isabel found a new, quiet rhythm. They weren't friends, not in the traditional sense. The scars were too deep for that. But they were partners in a new venture, co-parenting their children into adulthood. They spoke once a week, discussing Sophia's college applications or Leo's summer internship plans. The conversations were polite, sometimes a little formal, but underpinned by a new, hard-won respect. One Saturday afternoon, Nathaniel was at a local park, watching Sophia play in a weekend soccer league. From across the field, he saw Isabel on the sidelines, cheering. He had made a point of keeping his distance at these events, giving her space. But today she walked over to him. "She's gotten so much better at her corner kicks," Isabel said, her eyes on their daughter. "She has your determination," Nathaniel replied, a small smile touching his lips. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Two parents watching their child, a shared past and a separate future converging in the present moment. "Leo told me you helped him with his project," Isabel said, turning to look at him. "That was a good thing you did, Nathaniel." "It was the least I could do," he said. "No," she said, her gaze steady. "It wasn't. It was a start." A whistle blew, and the game was over. Sophia's team had won. She ran over, sweaty and beaming, and hugged her mom. Then she turned and, without hesitation, gave Nathaniel a hug, too. It was the first time she had initiated any physical affection since the separation. He held his daughter, overwhelmed, and caught Isabel's eye over Sophia's shoulder. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a promise of forgiveness, and it certainly wasn't a hint of reconciliation. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition that he was present, that he was trying, that the first stone of a new foundation had been laid. He knew he would never get back what he had so carelessly thrown away. The family he'd had was a country to which he could never return. But as he stood there, between the woman he had wronged and the daughter he was trying to win back, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The path to redemption was long and uncertain, but for the first time, he was finally walking in the right direction. This story is a powerful reminder that true wealth isn't measured by stock prices or square footage, but by the integrity of our relationships and the truth of our own stories. Nathaniel's journey from arrogant millionaire to repentant father shows that it's never too late to take accountability and begin the hard work of rebuilding. Isabel's quiet strength teaches us that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's found in the courage to demand the truth. What did you think of Isabel's final decision in court? Do you believe Nathaniel's redemption is real? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe for more emotional, true-to-life stories.